Welcome to my third lecture for existentialism, where we cover selections from Simone de Beauvoir's The Ethics of Ambiguity, selections from chapter 3, where she goes over the positive aspects of ambiguity. We're skipping the first section, which is entitled The Aesthetic Attitude, and going right to the second section called Freedom and Liberation. At the beginning of this section, she mentions what she calls indefinite conquests of existence over being, particularly human existence over being, this just inert matter that's out there. And these indefinite conquests that she's speaking of, she mentions four: science, technics, art, and philosophy. She says that these indefinite conquests, by assuming themselves, they take on, in light of this assumption, a word progress. They take this on and it finds its veridical meaning. It's truthful, it's honest, it's accurate meaning. Remember, the term useful doesn't have an objective meaning. You remember that from the first lecture. She thinks progress is the same. She thinks that progress finds its true meaning in fields like science, technics, art, and philosophy. It's not a matter in these fields of approaching some fixed limit, absolute knowledge per se in science, or the happiness of man in philosophy, or the perfection of beauty in art. In that case, she thinks all effort would be doomed to failure. So for man, it's a matter of pursuing the expansion of his existence. So how do these expand man's existence? Let's read from page 79. Science condemns itself to failure when, yielding to the infatuation of the serious, it aspires to attain being, to contain it, and to possess it. But it finds its truth if it considers itself as a free engagement of thought in the given, aiming at each discovery, not at fusion with the thing, but at the possibility of new discoveries. What the mind then projects is the concrete accomplishment of its freedom. And so, again, it's not a matter of getting absolute knowledge. Science will never have knowledge of everything. They'll never be done doing science where they can just, okay, we're done with science. Let's publish all 500 volumes. It's over. Science is over. Everybody's done. No, every discovery is gonna bring about even further discoveries and more possibilities. And sometimes she mentions that people try to find an objective justification of science in what she calls techniques. Really, I think she's talking about technology here, just given what she says. But she says that technics is not objectively justified. Technics, she says, will set up some goals that they call absolute, these absolute goals of the saving of time and work, which it enables us to realize. So we get the machines to do the work for us. We get to save time. We get comfort. We get luxury. These are all seen as just objectively good. But she thinks it's rather contradictory to speak of saving up existence. Existence only exists by being spent, by doing things. Remember, without acting, we're nothing. And there's a good case, de Beauvoir claims, that technological advancements do not make men happier today than those in former times. But it's not a case of giving men time and happiness, of stopping the movement of life. It's a question of fulfilling life for Simone. If technology attempts to make up for this lack at the heart of existence, right? This lack that makes us special for her, that makes our existence precede our essence. She says if technology tries to fill up that lack, then it will fail radically. But if technology moves forward in order to push itself even further forward, then it escapes all criticism. It opens up new possibilities to man. So I can imagine she probably would have mixed feelings about the internet. We could probably maybe discuss this in a paper, would be a good topic for a paper. The internet, I guess, can be used to fill up that lack at the heart of existence. We sit at home, we don't do anything. We live through our social websites, these social networking sites. But then again, it can also be used in revolutions over in Egypt and Tunisia, and even Iran in 2009. A lot of the protesters that were standing up against the government were using Twitter and Facebook to get out information about their points of view, which were not being voiced by the media in the country because it was controlled by the government that they were opposing. I'm sure that de Beauvoir would have approved of that use of the internet, which would open up new possibilities for man, but not other uses of the internet where we just sit at home and play video games. I think it's a double-edged sword there. But it'd be interesting to think about different forms of technology and how they could open up new possibilities for man, or how they try to make up for this lack at the heart of existence. As for art, one of these other indefinite conquests that she mentions, art, she thinks, should not attempt to set up idols. This lends itself too much to the serious. These clear-cut characters, which are obviously one or two dimensional. This guy's just a good guy. This guy's a bad guy, and it's obvious. It shouldn't set up these inhuman idols. It should reveal existence, she says, as a reason for existence. The constructive activities of man should take on a valid meaning only when they're assumed as a movement towards freedom. And anything that's serious, I think she seemed to be saying, is a movement away from this. Now, she says it's permissible to dream of a world where men will know no other use of their freedom than these free unfurlings, these indefinite conquests, science and philosophy and art, where constructive activity would be possible for everybody. But today, she says, the fact is that there are men who can justify their existence only through negative actions. Sometimes transcendence, this transcendence that she talks of, is condemned to fall uselessly back upon itself because it's cut off from its goals. This is what defines a situation of oppression for de Beauvoir. Such a situation, the situation of oppression, is never natural, she thinks. Man does not rebel against things, but against other men. And sure, men must assume some misfortunes. Remember, to despair, there's always a possibility of failure. But since he must never resign himself in favor of a thing, in other words, in favor of a concept or ideology or a passion, then no destruction of that thing will ever mean radical ruin. Even death is not evil for her, since mortality is a part of what makes us man. I'm not sure that Sartre would agree here. She sounds a bit like Heidegger when she says this about death. But we have to assume a natural limit to life. There's risk implied at every step. Remember despair, Sartre's despair. Only man can be an enemy of man. Only he can rob man of meaning. And this, I think, is what's wrong with the adventure. Remember, she's talking about Cortez. He doesn't rebel or conquer trees or buffalo. He conquers the Aztecs, right? They have to be free men for that to even mean anything. And so, again, only he can rob other men of meaning. It belongs to him to confer meaning. But each of us depends on the others. And what happens to me by means of the others depends upon me as regarding what it means, right? What does she mean by that? One does not submit to war or occupation as one submits to an earthquake. When Hurricane Ike was about to hit, you didn't have protesters going down to Galveston with signs telling Hurricane Ike to leave us alone. You don't rebel against natural occurrences. You rebel against other men in a world of other men. We have an interdependence with others. And this interdependence, she thinks, is what explains why oppression is possible and also why it's hateful. It is other men who help open my future to me, she thinks, to allow us to participate in a constructive movement. But instead of allowing us to participate in this constructive movement, oppressors will cut me off from my future. If they're doing this, they're changing me into a thing. I become the other for them. I become the object, not the subject or the individual. If all that life does is just maintain itself in this state, then human existence is indistinguishable from absurd vegetation. Oppression divides the world into two clans, us versus them, us versus the other. Those who enlighten mankind by pushing it forward, those who have actual freedom, positive freedom, and those who simply mark time to support the collectivity, who are kept in servitude, kept in the world of the serious, or even worse, in the sub-man. And if we read on page 83, we can sort of see the picture she's painting here even more vividly. Let's read on page 83. Their life, the oppressed, their life is a pure repetition of mechanical gestures. Their leisure is just about sufficient for them to regain their strength. The oppressor feeds himself on their transcendence and refuses to extend it by a free recognition. The oppressed only has one solution: to deny the harmony of that mankind from which an attempt is made to exclude him, to prove that he is a man and that he is free by revolting against the tyrants. In order to prevent this revolt, one of the ruses of oppression is to camouflage itself behind a natural situation, since after all, one cannot revolt against nature. So how does the upper class justify their oppression? They make it seem, just like it's just inevitable. You have to be this way. You're just an inferior type of person, an inferior type of being. You got these kind of arguments from slave owners during the years of the American slavery, North American slave trade. Continue where I left off on 83. When a conservative wishes to show that the proletariat is not oppressed, he declares that the present distribution of wealth is a natural fact, and that there is thus no means of rejecting it. And doubtless he has a good case for proving that. Strictly speaking, he's not stealing from the worker the product of his labor, since the word theft supposes social conventions, which in other respects authorizes this type of exploitation. But what the revolutionary means by this word is that the present regime is a human fact. As such, it has to be rejected. This rejection cuts off the will of the oppressor, in his turn, from the future towards which he was hoping to thrust himself alone. Another future is substituted, that of revolution. The struggle is not one of words and ideologies. It is real and concrete. If it is this future which triumphs and not the former, then it is the oppressed who is realized as a positive and open freedom, and the oppressor who becomes an obstacle and a thing. Now, when she uses the word conservative at the beginning of that quote, don't think of it in the modern connotation of right-wing or Republican conservative. It's probably broader than that. Somebody who just wants to conserve the status quo. And surely a lot of Republicans would fall into that description, but maybe not all of them. So when she uses the term conservative, keep this in mind. So she describes here in that passage I just read this proletariat uprising, an uprising of the oppressed, of the working class. It seems that after this uprising, the roles are reversed, that we have to deny someone their freedom somewhere along the lines. If we have to help these oppressed people gain their liberty and their freedom, inevitably it seems we're going to have to get freedom from somebody else. Now, de Beauvoir speaks of two ways of surpassing the given environment, the given world that you're thrown into, engaging in the world using your freedom. She describes one way as almost like taking a trip. We wake up one day and we're free and, well, I'm bored. I think I'm going to go to Galveston today. So I'm going to go to the store and get me some food and, we're going to have a little picnic out there, maybe a little barbecue on the beach. That's a little bit different. That's a way of surpassing the given, but it's much more different than trying to escape from a prison. This is much different. You wake up in the cell and try to figure out, how am I going to get out of here today? The given is present insofar as it's rejected. In the former case, the given is present insofar as it's accepted. What are we going to do today? Let's go to Galveston. What am I going to do today? How am I going to get out of this prison cell? Much different. Now, in this part of the reading, in about 84, 85, she starts getting anti-Hegel here. She's talking about this philosopher Hegel. Sometimes she mentions him by name, sometimes not. Don't worry if you were confused here. Her point is that revolution is never harmoniously integrated into the development of the world, a la Hegel. This is sort of Hegel's idea. Rather, she thinks that revolution or revolt explodes at the heart of the world and breaks its continuity. It's a total epoch shift. So the proletariat attitude, the attitude of the working class, is defined in negative terms by philosophers like Karl Marx. And that's correct, she thinks. She thinks it's correct that they define the working class, the oppressive class, in negative terms. to put an end to the proletariat as a class. That's what they want to do. They want to destroy themselves as an oppressed class. The only issue for them is a negative one. The situation they're stuck in must be eliminated, must be surpassed, must be overcome. And de Beauvoir makes this very strong claim, much like Sartre, that all the parties involved have an interest in the elimination of this situation. Each one needs to have all men free. Really? Well, I can see why the oppressed would want to do this, but why is the oppressor? What does the oppressor have to gain? Has she settled this already? Maybe she has a little bit when she was talking about the adventurer, the nihilist, and all these different disingenuous attitudes. But she says that we have to furnish the oppressed with the means of transcending their situation. We have to help them develop a consciousness of their situation and a consciousness of their freedom. But the conservative objects, the one who wants to conserve this situation, objects on page 86. But what right does one have to want something for others, asks the conservative, who regards the working man or the native as a grown-up child, and who does not hesitate to dispose of the child's will. Indeed, there is nothing more arbitrary than intervening as a stranger in a destiny which is not ours. One of the shocking things about charity, in the civic sense of the word, is it is practiced from the outside, according to the caprice of the one who distributes it and who is detached from the object. But the cause of freedom is not that of others more than it is mine. It is universally human. If I want the slave to become conscious of his servitude, it is both in order not to be a tyrant myself, for any abstention is complicity, and complicity in this case is tyranny, and in order that new possibilities might be opened to the liberated slave, and through him to all men. To want existence, to want to disclose the world, and to want men to be free are one and the same will. So I have to help make the slave conscious of his servitude, because otherwise I'm complicit. And if I'm complicit, that makes me a tyrant. And also, new possibilities will be opened up through the liberated slave, not just for him, but for all men. Can we think of some new possibilities that were opened up, not just to the oppressed, but to other people who are already free? If we think about the slaves in America, after they were emancipated, obviously new possibilities were open to them, but what possibilities were opened up to the white man? Well, by letting them be free and to participate in science and art, technology, they're able to contribute their own perspective and create new genres of music, blues, and jazz, and gospel music, and rhythm and blues, and really rock and roll. I mean, so if you think about it, if it wasn't for this, we wouldn't, even if you don't like any of those forms of music, if you think they're really bad, you hate jazz, you don't like blues, even if you don't like it, that's one possibility that you didn't have before. Now you can hate jazz, and that wasn't a possibility of your freedom. That's a part of your character if you don't like that music. So through giving other people freedom, if freedom is my goal, I only stand to gain. By letting them contribute to human signification, it opens up new possibilities, not just to them, but to myself, possibly. So she says, moreover, the oppressor is lying if he says that the oppressed positively want their oppression, right? That was really the first part of his objection. You know, how can you say that they want to be free? They don't know what freedom is. They want their oppression, that they need their oppression. That's all they know. So, you know, it's really lying. It's not really, it's very disingenuous for the oppressor to say they really positively want their oppression. Rather, they abstain from not wanting it because they're unaware that they have an option to reject it. She says the cause of freedom is the same for everyone, but she admits that the urgency of liberation is not the same for all. For the oppressed, this liberation is a literal necessity. For us who are free, it is simply a moral exigency. If we want to assert freedom, we have to seek their freedom as well. For them, though, they feel this liberation as a necessity. They have to escape the situation which is thrown upon them. So the oppressed, in a sense, are more totally engaged in the struggle, But every man is affected by this struggle in a very essential way, that one cannot fulfill oneself morally without taking a part in this struggle. And the problem is complicated. Today, as she says, oppression has more than one aspect. The end is to abolish all oppression, all suppression. But where do we start? Do we start, if she's in France in the 40s, do we start with the French working class, the French proletariat? Do we go to the French colonies and help the natives in the colonies? What order do we follow? What tactics should we adopt? She seems to say that it's a matter of opportunity and efficiency. The old adage, think globally but act locally. Do what you can do. It really depends on your individual situation. And she makes a pretty interesting point here on 89. Towards the middle of the page, it is possible that he may be led, the man who is looking for freedom for everybody, he may be led to sacrifice temporarily a cause whose success is subordinate to that of a cause whose defense is more urgent. On the other hand, it is possible that one may judge it necessary to maintain the tension of revolt against a situation to which one does not wish to consent at any price. Thus, during the war, when the Negro leaders in America were asked to drop their own claims for the sake of the general interest, Richard Wright refused. He thought that even in time of war, his cause had to be defended. In any case, morality requires that the combatant be not blinded by the goal which he sets up for himself to the point of falling into the fanaticism, seriousness, or passion. The cause which he serves must not lock itself up and thus create a new element of separation. Through his own struggle, he must seek to serve the universal cause of freedom. So she mentions this Richard Wright, who refused to serve in the war. She's speaking of World War II. And the point I think she's making is whether or not that was right for him to refuse, we can't get too serious. He refused to serve because of the segregation in the military. The blacks were segregated from the whites. And this is a protest. They wanted equal rights. Remember, this is before the civil rights movement really got into full effect when she's writing this. And I think the point she's making is that perhaps he should have set aside that cause for African Americans to help freedom overall, because Hitler was trying to take freedom from all of the Western countries and have this sort of dictatorship over the world. So while that is imminent and we have to stop it now, let's do this, and then we'll get back to your other struggle for freedom. And you can see maybe in the end this worked out. After the war was over, a lot of the African American, the civil rights leaders could use this as an example of all the contributions that had been made by African Americans to the war effort. Many of them were heroes and helped win the war. And so this really worked to their advantage. But again, her point is that we can't get so stuck up in our struggle, we can't get so blinded by our struggle that we don't see this universal struggle, freedom for everybody. So sometimes we have to temporarily postpone specific goals for this greater goal of freedom for all. Now, again, the oppressor might object. What cost is this? You're taking away my freedom. She thinks there's a contradiction here that's dishonestly concealed. We have to respect freedom only when it's intended for freedom. This sort of freedom that the oppressor wants is a demand of property, a feeling of possession, of capital, comfort, of moral security. A freedom that is only interested in denying freedom, she thinks must itself be denied. She says, I am oppressed if I am thrown into a prison, but not if I'm kept from throwing my neighbor into a prison. But usually the oppressor is conscious that this argument really won't work, so instead he presents himself as a defender of certain values. He's fighting for the greater good, for what's best, and she replies to this on page 91. It is not in his own name that he is fighting, but rather in the name of civilization, of institutions, of monuments, and of virtues which realize objectively the situation which he intends to maintain. He declares that all these things are beautiful and good in themselves. He defends a past which he has assumed the icy dignity of being against an uncertain future whose values have not yet been won. This is what is well expressed by the label conservative. As some people are curators of a museum or a collection of medals, Others make themselves the curators of the given world, stressing the sacrifices that are necessarily involved in all change. They side with what has been over against what has not yet been. So conservatives are defenders of the past and defenders of the status quo. She doesn't want to disparage interest or veneration for our past. That's not what she's doing here. We should venerate our past, our culture, our art, religion, history, etc. And some revolutionaries do. But no, to assert the reign of the human is to acknowledge man in the past as well as the future. The fact of having a past is a part of the human condition. We must try, she says, through our living projects, to turn to our account that freedom which was undertaken in the past and try to integrate it into the present world. But on the other hand, she asserts that the past only concerns us insofar as it has human signification. We can't let the past lead us to preferring the thing, the object, to man, to prefer the tradition or the institution versus the individuals who are involved in the tradition or the institution. The thing, the institution, the tradition, only receives value, she claims, from man, from humankind. Let's read on page 94. We may be moved by dances, songs, and regional costumes because these inventions represent the only free accomplishment which was allowed the peasants amidst the hard conditions under which they formerly lived. By means of these creations, they tore themselves away from their servile work, transcended their situation, and asserted themselves as men before the beasts of burden. Wherever these festivals still exist spontaneously, where they have retained their character, they have their meaning and their value. But when they are ceremoniously reproduced for the edification of indifferent tourists, they are no more than a boring documentary, even an odious mystification. It is a sophism to want to maintain by coercion things which derive their worth from the fact that men attempted through them to escape from coercion. Skipping forward to the bottom of the page there, she writes, but at the heart, these conservatives know that these objects are less precious in themselves than as the manifestation of the civilization which they represent. So the oppressors can never justify themselves in the name of some idol or some content that they set up themselves. One doesn't really love the past if one wants to preserve it in some hardened and mummified form. The past is an appeal for de Beauvoir. It's an appeal towards the future. We look to the past for what we've accomplished to give us an idea of what we can go and do and move beyond. The oppressor doesn't always justify himself, though, as a conserver, she says. It's oftentimes in the name of the future, of progress, of production, that the oppressor will justify themselves. She says, only the colonialist is capable of exploiting the wealth of which the native would let go to waste. We often got this argument in the age of colonialism. The oppressor tries to appeal to utility as a defense. But we've seen how de Beauvoir has shown that this is a lie. It's dishonest. It's something that the serious tries to do. The serious man tries to give the word useful an absolute meaning. So that would be her reply to this objection. Nothing is useful if it's not useful to man. Nothing is useful to man if he's not free. And sure, the oppressive regime might achieve constructions that will serve man. Look to modern day China. We might have a very efficient regime. It's got a big economy. But she says that this will only serve us when we're free to use these good things. As long as the reign of the oppressor lasts, none of these benefits, quote unquote, are real. We can never prefer, again, the thing to man. And finally, the oppressor, she admits, does have a good case for showing that respect for freedom is never without difficulty. It's hard to respect all freedoms at the same time. But this is a tension of the struggle. It's inherent in the struggle. We have to reject oppression at any cost. And this brings us to the next section, section 3, entitled The Antinomies of Action. What does she mean by antinomies of action? The word antinomy Originally, I remember reading Kant when I first heard of this term, and Kant uses it in a bit of a different sense, but it's similar. For Kant, an antinomy is a pair of arguments that both argue for completely opposite things. And he thinks that both of these arguments are supposed to be deductively valid. They're good, sound arguments. The problem is, they're arguing for opposite views. The way that de Beauvoir is using the word antinomy, it's not a pair of arguments, but rather it's this paradoxical situation that we're in when we're involved in actions which seek to promote freedom. These are the antinomies of action, that whenever we promote freedom, eventually we have to deny somebody's freedom, sometimes even our own. We have to sacrifice our own freedom for this greater cause of freedom itself. So this would be the antinomies of action. She says that a reconciliation of all freedoms is perhaps unimaginable and impossible, and no one any longer dares abandon themselves to these utopian reveries, as she calls them. We can't count upon a collective conversion where everybody acknowledge everybody's freedom. The oppressors represent, in the eyes of all men of goodwill, those who assert their freedom, the oppressors represent the absurdity of facticity. The oppressor worships the object. The facticity is worshipped over the individual subjectivity. And ethics, she thinks, existentialist ethics, calls for a triumph of freedom over facticity. So the oppressor must be suppressed. This is the demand of existentialist ethics. We can't act on the oppressor's subjectivity. We can't convince them. They want the power. They want their possession. So we can only act upon their objective presence, their body or what they own or something like this. Others will have to be treated like things, with violence perhaps, either literally violent or figuratively. The sad fact of man's separation from man is confirmed, and the oppressor is oppressed in turn. In this struggle, one is forced to treat certain men as things in order to win freedom for all. Freedom which is occupied in denying freedom, she claims, is so outrageous that the outrageousness of the violence which one practices against it is almost canceled out. She seems to be on the side of someone like Malcolm X and anti-Martin Luther King. She seems to say that violence is occasionally justified if it's violence being used to stop somebody who's oppressing others, who's denying them their freedom. And she says that this often leads us to have to kill a few people or maybe get violent. And this is unfortunate. She's not saying it's a good thing, but it's inevitable. It's a part of the antinomies of action. She says the oppressor needs accomplices who are complicit, and these often become unfortunate casualties. Read on, as she writes on page 98. But the oppressor would not be so strong if he did not have accomplices among the oppressed themselves. Mystification is one of the forms of oppression. Ignorance is a situation in which man may be enclosed as narrowly as in a prison. We have already said every individual may practice his freedom inside his world, but not everyone has the means of rejecting, even by doubt, the values, taboos, and prescriptions by which he is surrounded. Doubtless, respectful minds take the object of their respect for their own, and in this sense they are responsible for it, as they are responsible for their presence in the world. But they are not guilty if their adhesion is not a resignation of their freedom. When a young 16-year-old Nazi died crying, "Heil Hitler," he was not guilty. It was not he whom we hated, but his masters. The desirable thing would be to re-educate this misled youth. It would be necessary to expose the mystification and to put the men who are its victims in the presence of their freedom. But the urgency of the struggle forbids this slow labor. We are obliged to destroy not only the oppressor, but also those who serve him, whether they do so out of ignorance or out of constraint. So she makes an interesting distinction here between what she calls guilt and responsibility. We have to destroy not only the oppressor, but also the servants that he uses to keep his oppression going. Even though the servants may not be guilty, they're still responsible. So they're not guilty of the ideology. The Hitler Youth was not guilty of the Nazi anti-Semitic ideology, but he was responsible for asserting it. And unfortunately, because we can only conquer our enemies by acting upon their facticity, We also have to make ourselves sometimes into objects. We have to be willing to sacrifice ourselves or others, maybe, at least temporarily, to fight the greatest oppression. We have an oppressive tyrant of the magnitude of a Hitler. She writes, every war, every revolution demands the sacrifice of a generation, of a collectivity, by those who undertake it. And the paradox that's revealed, the antinomy, is that no action can be generated for man without it's immediately being generated against men, at least certain men, the oppressors. And this is a bitter truth that's often masked. We try to hide it, almost like our freedom. And revolutionaries sometimes pass from the serious to nihilism. They set up this unconditioned value of their end, the revolution itself, and they set up an insignificance of men who they use as instruments. This is a nihilism. And she says on page 102, if in all oppressed countries a child's face is so moving, it's not that the child is more moving or that he has a right to more happiness than others. It is that he is a living affirmation of human transcendence. He is a hope. He is a project. If the oppressor's contempt for man is convenient, it is also dangerous. Men lose a zest for life and a readiness to risk it. And so if we get lost in the serious, if we get lost in the struggle, we have to sort of be careful that we don't turn into nihilists or serious men or the passionate men. A doctrine which aims at liberation, she says, cannot rest on contempt for the individual. So here's where she gets anti-Marxian, anti-Hegelian, anti-collectivist, right? It's Hegel and Marx, they see the individual as insignificant. The individual, like Aristotle, is only significant in the context of a society, society as the whole. And so she is very suspicious of this. That this doctrine, that any doctrine that's set up, can propose to us no other salvation than subordination to the collectivity. Let's read on 103 at the bottom. The finite is nothing if it is not its transition to the infinite. The death of an individual is not a failure if it is integrated into a project which surpasses the limits of life. The substance of this life being outside of the individual himself in the class, in the socialist state. Now, this is the view that we get from Marx or Hegel. But she writes, if the individual is taught to consent to his sacrifice, the latter is abolished as such. And the soldier who has renounced himself in favor of his cause will die joyfully. In fact, that is how the young Hitlerians died. We know how many edifying speeches this philosophy has inspired. It is by losing oneself that one finds himself, by dying that one fulfills his life, by accepting servitude that one realizes his freedom. All leaders of men preach in this vein. And if there are any who refuse to heed this language, they are wrong. They're cowards. As such, they're worthless. They aren't worth anyone's bothering with. The brave man dies gaily of his own free will. The one who rejects death deserves only to die. There you have the problem elegantly resolved. So such a doctrine like Hegel's or Marx's, she feels this empties the human world of what she calls its sensible thickness. Individuality is denied, and moral salvation lies in surpassing towards another, who will also surpass towards this higher end that all fits into some system, some doctrine. And this system, she thinks, is this huge mystification. It subordinates all the moments that lead up to the goal. It subordinates all these to the goal itself, whose coming it dares not set up. It's almost like it doesn't want to reach the goal. It wants to keep this system going. But if the individual is nothing, right? If the individual doesn't mean anything, she thinks society cannot be something. 0 multiplied by any number is still 0. Only the subject can justify his own existence, and he can't be regarded as a nothing, since consciousness of all things is within him. So this sort of nihilistic pessimism, or even a rationalistic optimism that might result from this sort of revolutionary thinking of Hegel and Marx, they fail when they try to juggle away the bitter truth of sacrifice, as she puts it. Sacrifice means something. And for Hegel, it really doesn't. It means something, but it means something in a larger context. The individual, again, is insignificant. It's all a part of this larger picture. Same thing for Marx. And she says, again, this tries to juggle away the bitter truth of sacrifice. It also eliminates any reason for wanting to sacrifice. She mentions this girl who needed to get cured. This example, this is on page 106. Someone told a young invalid who wept because she had to leave her home, her occupations, and her whole past life, "Get cured. The rest has no importance." "But if nothing has any importance," she answered, "what good is it to get cured?" She was right. In order for this world to have any importance, in order for our undertaking to have a meaning and to be worthy of sacrifices, we must affirm the concrete and particular thickness of this world and the individual reality of our projects and ourselves. This is what the democratic societies understand. They strive to confirm citizens in the feeling of their individual value. The whole ceremonious apparatus of baptism, marriage, and burial is the collectivity's homage to the individual, and the rights of justice seek to manifest society's respect for each of its members considered in his particularity. After or during a period of violence, when men are treated like objects, one is astonished, even irritated, at seeing human life rediscover, in certain cases, a sacred character. Why those hesitations of the courts, those long drawn-out trials, since men died by the million, like animals, since the very ones being judged coldly massacred them? She's talking obviously of the Holocaust and the Nuremberg trials. The reason is that once the period of crisis in which the democracies themselves, whether they liked it or not, had to resort to blind violence, has passed, they now aim to reestablish the individual within his rights. More than ever, they must restore to their members the sense of their dignity, the sense of the dignity of each man, taken one by one. The soldier must become a citizen again, so that the city may continue to subsist as such, may continue to deserve one's dedicating oneself to it. So even after blind violence, the democratic state has to resume its respect for individual rights, even those of the enemy. If the individual is kept unique and irreducible, then sacrifice actually means something. Otherwise, it doesn't. A collectivist conception of man, she thinks, does not concede a valid existence to such sentiments as love, tenderness, or even friendship. If individuals recognize themselves in their differences, then individual relations are established, she concurs, among men, and each one becomes irreplaceable for a few others. The people in our lives are significant. We can't just replace them with somebody that has the same name, same height, same hair color. That's an individual that if they're gone, if they're lost in the sacrifice, if they're lost in the war, then that's an individual that will never come back. That's an irreducible, significant individual, part of our life, and it's a sacrifice. If the individual doesn't mean anything, says de Beauvoir, then neither does the entire city, neither does the state, neither does the country. So again, these individual relations that we have, that we establish among ourselves, among men, they become irreducible, irreplaceable relations. Wrapping things up here, she does make a few comments about authoritarian parties thinking of thought as a danger and reflection as a crime. She says even if the opponent is wrong, he or she brings to light a certain truth that there is a place in the world for error and subjectivity. Even if the opponent is wrong, they show that men in power may be mistaken. So the authoritarian regime doesn't want anybody to think, doesn't want anybody to criticize it. They often use the doctrine of necessity as a weapon. Let's read on page 110 what she means by this. The doctrine of necessity is much more a weapon than a faith. If they use it, they do so because they know well enough that the soldier may act otherwise than he does, otherwise than the way they want him to, that he may disobey. They know well enough that he is free and that they are fettering his freedom. It is the first sacrifice that they impose upon him. In order to achieve the liberation of men, he has to give up his own freedom, even his freedom of thought. In order to mask the violence, What they do is to have recourse to a new violence which even invades his mind. So in all regimes, revolutionary or oppressive regimes, violence is excused in the name of utility. Utility legitimizes sacrifice. But as we have seen, useful, this term useful, has no absolute meaning, she argues, right? It has no absolute meaning in itself. A thing or a cause is raised to the dignity of an unconditioned end in these despotic rulers in some of these revolutionary regimes. And she says human efforts and lives can no more be treated as instruments than human work can be treated as a simple merchandise. Even the most disciplined soldier would mutiny if skillful propaganda didn't persuade him that he's dedicating himself to the cause of man, to his cause. So to serve some men, we have to do disservice to others in the end. This is part of the antinomies of action for Simone de Beauvoir. So by what principle do we decide who? Who do we give freedom to? Who do we take it away? Now remember that the supreme end at which all men must aim is freedom. So should we appeal to quantity, the most freedom for the most amount of people? Sounds a little bit like utilitarianism. Is that logical? Maybe it is, but is it right? Can we appeal to uniqueness, spare those who are the most important, who are specialists? Again, this is another way to rationalize massacres. But these rationalizations will move from one useful to another. The complement of the useful is man, right? He makes this word make sense. But future, she thinks, is the complement to useful. And by adding future to the word useful, we might get a little bit of direction of where to go, where to push freedom. Man is the future of man. Remember, this is what Sartre says in his lecture. Only the future can take the present for its own, she says, and keep it alive by surpassing it. Remember, man has to make himself a lack of being, so he's thrown forward into a future. He wants to become something. So no action for her is conceivable without this sovereign affirmation of the future. And the future cannot be seen as a finality. We can't think of a final judgment or things where things will be resolved. The future has to be a constant transcending. The future has to be a future of self-perpetuating freedom, not the illusion of a stationary future. So what about these charges about being over-individualistic? There's a little passage from page 156, which you don't have on your handout, but I'll read it here to close our exploration of existentialist ethics. Again, maybe this is way too individualistic. You have to have this society for meaning to even occur. Maybe she's even giving us too much freedom. And this is part of her conclusion. Again, it's from 156 of, you don't have it, but it's from the same work we've been covering. She asks, is this kind of ethics individualistic or not? Yes, if one means by that it accords to the individual an absolute value, and that it recognizes in him alone the power of laying the foundations of his own existence. It is individualism in the sense in which the wisdom of the ancients, the Christian ethics of salvation, and the Kantian ideal of virtue also merit this name. It is opposed to the totalitarian doctrines which raise up beyond man the mirage of mankind. But it is not solipsistic, since the individual is defined only by his relationship to the world and to other individuals. He exists only by transcending himself, and his freedom can be achieved only through the freedom of others. He justifies his existence by a movement which, like freedom, springs from his heart, but which leads outside of him. Regardless of the staggering dimensions of the world about us, the density of our ignorance, the risk of catastrophes to come, and our individual weakness within the immense collectivity, the fact remains that we are absolutely free today if we choose to will our existence in its finiteness, a finiteness which is open on the infinite. And in fact, any man who has known real loves, real revolts, real desires, and real will knows quite well that he has no need of any outside guarantee to be sure of his goals. Their certitude comes from his own drive. There is the very old saying which says, "Do what you must, come what may." That amounts to saying in a different way that the result is not external to the good will which fulfills itself in aiming at it. If it came to be that each man did what he must, existence would be saved in each one without there being any need of dreaming of a paradise